Thank you for having me here today. I wanted to thank you all for joining us. And I wanted to, before I head into what I wanted to speak about, I want to go back to 2001, to the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance that was held in South Africa. The assembly met from August 31st to September 8th, 2001. And at that time, my government walked away from the meeting. And it was really sad because it was part of the United States' efforts to not recognize the racism that was also part of the way that we operated. And so I wanted to read a part of that declaration, which said that drawing inspiration from the heroic struggle of the people of South Africa against the institutionalized system of apartheid, as well as for equality and justice under democracy, development, and the rule of law, and respect for human rights, recalling in this context the important contribution to the struggle of the international community, and in particular, the pivotal role of the people and governments of Africa, and noting the important role that different actors of civil society, including NGOs, played in the struggle and ongoing efforts to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. And so it's important for us to see how these struggles are really related on an international level, but how the struggle for environmental rights, environmental justice is also related to the struggle for fighting racism. And what we have seen is when corporations rule, when capitalism rules, the environment and the earth suffer, and more so people also suffer. And so one of the issues that is important for us to do is to be able to see that we have to be able to decide our own destiny. Dr. Martin Luther King had said in the United States that the work that he had been doing was really also work for environmental regulations, particularly for urban environments which are populated by discriminated or neglected groups. Within years of Dr. King's 1963 I Have a Dream speech, environmental defenders succeeded in pressuring the government to push through important legislation such as the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act. For Dr. King, basic civil rights went well beyond freedom, equality, and the end of racial segregation. He was particularly adamant about about environmental justice, and that everyone would have a right to clean air, water, and soil, as well as to live in a healthy and nurturing environment. Dr. King had said in his 1967 Christmas sermon, it really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all of us indirectly. We are made to live together because of an interrelated structure of reality. And so for me as a law professor, I recognize the importance for us to take ownership of our democracy. And we have seen in response to the pandemic response, as well as movements in migration and climate change and environmental justice, and even in the film that we've seen regarding Uniontown, all of these issues are really inextricably linked. And we can no longer draw neat borders around the environmentalism of white spaces, of first world countries, of sprawling suburbs and countryside settings. For environmentalism and climate change adaptation efforts to work, they can no longer be the exclusive domain of protecting white spaces, and particularly for the bloc of OECD countries. Because there is rising income inequality in poor nations, as well as conflict and political upheaval, there's starting to see more internal as well as international displacement of people who are seeking out places for safety. And so the film that you saw involving Uniontown shows the interconnections between corporations, as well as the idea of environmentalism, as well as the constraints that are placed on environmental law at the local level. And so also, I think what is important to highlight in the United States is that a lot of these different incidences of involving environmental pollution, and the fact they occur in a minority, majority minority areas, it's important to see that these are not isolated events that are occurring, but they're part of a larger, more systemic type of racism that has been occurring. And it's also important to see that that what we also see happening is that these events actually put people in cages, and sometimes like physical cages as well as metaphorical cages, and that they're segregated, and they're not able to move as freely as other parts of the population, and that they're marginalized communities. And so corporatism, I think, is an important concept to highlight here. Corporatism is a system of interest and attitude representation. It's the particular modal and ideal typical institutional arrangement for linking the associationally organized interest of civil society with the decisional structures of the state. And so when we look and see how corporatism works, it really works to silence frontline communities and those who are going to suffer from the adverse impacts of climate change. And so what we see happening, as you saw in Uniontown, is that vulnerable communities are located in sacrifice zones, and that they have less of a right to be here in the United States or on the planet. And so therefore they require less of a need for a clean environment. And so there's an old adage from a Roman philosopher, Cicero, who said that summum jus, summum injuria. And this saying, more laws or more injustice, has really inspired modern conversation about how severe laws need to be retooled because of the intended and unintended consequences of the laws that lead to more injustice and more inequality. And so, and just in concluding, I think it's important to look and see how environmental resistance movements, whether they're climate youth movement mobilization as well as youth reform, are going to really be bringing the change that is needed. One of those such reforms in the United States is Senate Bill 2236, which is the Environmental Justice Act of 2019. It was reintroduced by Senator Cory Booker, as well as the House companion House bill, which is 3923, which was introduced by U.S. Representative Raul Ruiz. And these, a portion of the House bill was included within a Clean Economy, Jobs and Innovation Act last year. And so if environmental legislation is passed at the federal level, it would be the first major piece of environmental legislation since the flurry of environmental legislation in the 1970s. The bill would seek to codify an executive order on environmental justice, as well as establish requirements for addressing environmental justice. It would also seek to create private rights of action for discriminatory practices under the Civil Rights Act. And it would also clarify communities that are impacted by events such as the Flint water crisis and how they can seek specific types of injunctive relief. So I think this is, it's an exciting time to be working in the area of environmental justice, even though there has been so much harm that has been brought about to communities. I think that we can, move forward. And I think the law is really a tool for bringing about that change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I think there'll be questions about the bill that's just been introduced. I'm sure you'll have heard that in South Africa we have environmental justice as a frame that's already embedded in existing legislation, but we still have a lot of environmental injustice. The legislation can only do so much, but at least it's a start. It creates a legal obligation to respond to problems. I think we'll reserve question time for once all three speakers have finished. So for now, we're a little bit ahead of time, which is great, and I'll pass over to Dr. Louis Snyman to take the conversation further from a South African perspective.
Thanks so much, Melanie, and thank you so much, Professor Ahmad. It's really interesting to see the similarities that exist between the jurisdictions and how environmental justice is this constant principle that just takes different forms, but has these constant base kind of elements to it that are applicable internationally. And just concerning the film, and just from my side, CALS represents largely mine-affected communities within our environmental justice program. And the reason for that is because of the enormous impact of mining. And the similarities with this particular film was quite interesting. And I thought it was an excellent representation. So many of the different aspects and manifestations of environmental injustice, particularly the structural forces. I thought the structural forces that constrain marginalized groups from fully participating in decisions. This is about decision making. This is about participation. This is about voices being heard. And these decisions fundamentally affecting people's lives. So I picked up a couple things from a structural forces point of view: economic, social, political histories, maybe some corruption in terms of that, lack of political, administrative, judicial processes supporting their inclusion. And all of these kind of together creates this perfect storm of environmental injustice. And for me, the environmental justice debates and the similarities between the United States and South Africa, I think go back to the history of environmental justice and the sprouting of grassroots movements and reactions, particularly in the early 80s in the States, to hazardous chemical plants built in communities across America. I mean, this is truly where, when you look back at environmental injustice, you can mention the Warren County cases, the Chester cases, these cases that kind of created this collective movement against these environmental injustices. And you see how that has progressed and how we see it in the South African landscape currently. And I think when you go to the core of it, it's very clear that there's a correlation between high impact sites. Now, it's not just mining, it's not just hazardous medical facilities, it's high impact environmental sites and economic status. There's a racism, there's a classism that is constant throughout. And we see, and I'm glad Melanie raised the slap suits, we see these well-resourced companies often against marginalized communities who do not have access to the same kinds of resources. And these are David versus Goliath fights. These are David versus Goliath fights that often result in intimidation, in reaction to speaking truth to power and speaking about what people's involvement is in the decisions that fundamentally impact their lives. And if you think about, South Africa has an environmental right, but a lot of also basic rights and basic rights that are linked to environment. You think about the right to housing, you think about the right to food, you think about all these, the right to water. None of these can truly be realized without the environmental right being the basis of those. You can't build a house in contaminated land. You can't drink contaminated water. You can't work. You can't be educated in contaminated environment. This is so so interconnected that the environmental debate can be stretched to almost any kind of, and often post-colonial society issues. And for me, I think this issue of, in a post-colonial landscape, removing people from their lands to colonize, farm, and mine. This might be, South Africa's had 100 years worth of mining. But where are we now? We are still in an area where people are left to inhabit areas that are not fit for human habitation. And these are areas where the exclusion and marginalization of disaffected citizens, of processes, of decisions are a symptom of that. And I think the connection between race, class, and the distribution of environmental hazards is very clear in a South African context and very clear in a mining context. And bringing it back, I think it's all about shifting impacts. And you see this a lot in the film. For instance, we all have waste. We all have medical waste. We all have sewage. We all have refuse. Yet the negative impacts of those sometimes benefits, we can say, are focused on a specific sector of people, a specific area, specific region that often is put in a position where it doesn't have the same political clout to influence decisions that impact their lives. And it's very clear within us, and the frustration is very clear from the movie. A good example we use here, for instance, is the area, we have an area, the Witbank mining area. It's around Mpumalanga, where most of the power generation plants sit, as well as many they're coal-fired power stations, as well as the coal mines. And it's interesting that the people that are impacted most by this mineral energy complex, but also the kind of the creation of electricity, don't actually have access to electricity. And if you think about how that injustice plays out, it is the environmental justice, for me, is based on the distributive paradigm, where the usage of natural resources throughout that process, the benefits and the burdens must be shared equally. You can't have all the benefits being accrued to one area and all the burdens being accrued to another area. And we have that, and it's very clear in a South African context. It's very clear in a power generation context, in a mining context, and it's obvious why. The reasoning for me is developers and politicians seek the path of least resistance. And when you are allocating these benefits of environmental protection and these constitutional rights, politicians are more responsive to sectors with more political influence. Community activists in the movie, and I was very interested by this, they recognize this linkage. They recognize this linkage and therefore support their own candidate to effect real change. And I thought that was a really kind of progressive step, that not only are they activists, not only are they trying to channel their frustrations through all the legitimate channels and create a movement, but they are supporting their own candidate for real change. They understand how the system works. They understand why they are being affected in the manner in which they are. So I think for me, this film was actually very, very illuminating from looking at the similarities and how constant the modus operandi of large corporate actors is, how predictable it is. And if you look at slap suits and intimidation, I mean, South Africa has just had a landmark case in the Riddle case, where we saw the judge actually speak of the DNA of slap suits. I mean, this is happening every day in South Africa. And it's not just litigation, it's assassinations, it's intimidation. We've had an assassination recently. We had assassination not too long ago in Comrade Bazooka as well. And these are meant to send a message. It's meant to spread fear. But if I look at how the movement is continuing to grow in South Africa in pursuit of environmental justice, although these are very scary things to happen to anybody, particularly the activists who are on the front line, and even the attorneys being slapped with these slap suits, I see such a collective effort and people speaking the same kind of language when it comes to the principles of environmental justice. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thanks so much. It's great to have that comparative perspective between the two jurisdictions, to see some of the similarities, and this judgment that's just been handed down, that Louis mentions in response to strategic litigation against public participation by environmental activists. I've added the link into the chat so you can have a look at it. It's really an incredible judgment, seeking to stop powerful interests from abusing the court process to prevent activism and participation. And one of the big differences, I think, between the US and South Africa, which is something we can maybe touch on later, is that South Africa has been designed as a participatory democracy, which means our democracy is not intended to begin and end at the election polls, it's intended to be an ongoing democracy that occurs all the time. And so attempts to squash that participation need to be addressed. And this judgment is one of the things that addresses that. And it also explains why in the US and in Uniontown in the film, we see the activists using elections, so using that institutional version of democracy to respond to this problem. To get a seat at the table, they must be elected participants. And so they make sure someone's elected, as Louis has just said. And that was a very empowering thing for them to do. So certainly not least, but our last presenter is Dr. Desmond Dasa, and I'll hand over to him to give us the activist perspective on these issues. Thank you so much for taking the time out, Dr. Dasa. We look forward to hearing from you.
So good evening, everyone, and thanks, Melanie, for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about the lived experience. I know the other speakers have touched on a number of points. I must say that it didn't shock me when I saw the film, having traveled to the US and seen the atrocities that take place in particular migrant communities in the South. I went to Port Arthur in 2003 and drove up the Mississippi and saw all the disaster and all the high levels of pollution, the nightmare that I saw there, 56 petrochemical refineries. It's still occurring in poor Black communities in the US. They're losing their gravesites. They've been moved off. I was in Lake Charles. The South African State Oil Corporation built the biggest liquid to gas plant, $50 billion US that they spent to build a massive plant there. And like they were during the apartheid era, a lot of Black folks were moved off the land in South Africa. The same thing happened. They done that. They done the same thing in the US in Lake Charles. Communities were removed off the land. They couldn't visit their graveyards, and they weren't fairly compensated for that land and the properties they had on the land. And that fight still continues up until today. So it's that film was a good example of what I witnessed in the US. And back home in South Africa is no difference. As much as we have the most progressive constitution, we have all the environmental laws. The environmental racism continues to be fostered onto people of color. And in Durban, where I come from, over 800,000 people, predominantly Black folks, live in the shadow of the biggest chemical industry in South Africa. Massive oil refinery, the biggest storage facilities in South Africa as well, and in the Southern Hemisphere. Now, we were products of forced removal during the apartheid era. So we are taken away from fresh air, clean soil, clean running water, lovely fresh vegetables, to be placed in concrete blocks and to be buffer zones where our lungs became the receptive for breathing in toxic pollution. And that has been the nightmare. And in the 80s, well, we weren't allowed there to go near the refineries or even to express ourselves as we were being arrested because the laws at that time, the National Key Point Act that protected strategic industries, you wouldn't go near them, you wouldn't even go near the gate. But Mandela, when he just came out of prison in 94 and 95, after the elections in 95, we came to South Durban. We tested the law. We went and strategically blocked the gates of the petrochemical refinery. For the first time we started to block the gates and we shook the gates up and we blocked the streets. And I don't think I certainly believe Mandela wasn't there, we would have been shot at by the security forces. So we know that the laws are still there that protect these big corporations that continue to criminalize people. I've had 7 interdicts I had to fight off. I was arrested in 2001, taken on the big petrochemical industry. So I had my place petrol bombed. So we talk about experience, taking up and be defenders of the planet and the environment. I know fully well of the dirty tricks of the big corporations, as well as the way they criminalize people fighting and defending for their rights, despite the constitutional guarantee that you can fight for the right to a healthy and clean environment. I must also say that the pollution levels are huge in South Durban. We've got the highest levels of asthma, 52.5%. So 2 health studies have shown people of color living next to these polluting industries, we were breathing in all the sulfur and all the other toxins. The levels of cancer are very high. And even the cancer ratio hasn't got a synopsis of what the levels are in South Durban because it's all put into one pot. But it's quite high. We know the studies show that there was an increased levels in the risk, the cancer risk to the people. So school kids on a regular basis are gassed out. And these are predominantly all Black schools in the area. So their quality of education is deteriorating all the time. They can't even stop pollutions that come through. We've documented all the incidents and explosions since 1995. The evidence is out there. The studies have vindicated us, and we've been in the international journal that shows the health problems of the area in South Durban, how they've been used as buffer zones to breathing, as I said, breathing all those toxic chemicals. Lots of our people, our families have died of cancer. I know my personal circumstances. I've had brothers died of cancer. So it comes home to each and every one of us that live here. But what's sad about this, not only we've got the big international corporations, Shell, BP, and all that. And I've done exchange visits to all other parts of the world. For example, we went to Denmark in 2001 and 2002. And I came back convinced that the big chemical corporations had double standards. They had one standard for Black lives in South Africa and a different standards for European lives. And the comparison was clear. It showed that the European lives were treated better. They brought in the best technology. They did not pollute as much as what they were polluting in South Africa. In South Africa, we were getting something like about 120,000 tons a year of sulfur. In Denmark, at the best refinery, the Fredericia, the Shell refinery, was something like about 2,000 tons. So it shows the different differences. But what's critical, we came back understanding that there were double standards. And the evidence showed that. But what was even worse, that if you went into Africa, in Nigeria, or you went to Angola, the standards were even worse. So they took even some of the rotten units that they would replace in other parts of the world and bring it to Africa, and we would become the dumping ground. So racism was very, very straight. And it still continues to. The problem with having all the laws is that we as a society realized quite some time now that we need to stand on our own because government has abandoned a vast majority of us and is not interested in dealing with the big corporations. It's what we call corporate capture. So the big corporations can pollute and they get away with it. We've had massive explosions in the area. The last one happened on the 4th of December, the engine refinery still shut. So that refinery injured a lot of workers, but it also injured the communities on the fence line. So you're just across the road, finally blows up, and children are burnt and affected, parents are affected, all the people's belongings are burnt. So this continues, and government is reluctant to come and deal with the problem. We did get the portfolio committee after a lot of pressure from us to come down and deal with it. But local government has been captured because they depend on all the rates. They depend on the amount of money that the industries provide for their budgets. So they're not going to want to prosecute and enforce the law. As much as we got the law, there's no enforcement of the law in Durban. And because it's Black lives, it doesn't matter. If it was one of the elite suburbs and township and suburbs, they would act immediately because people would demand of it, and they would have the resources with lawyers and all that, senior lawyers to take them on. I know that there was talk of people being killed, and that's the truth. I've worked all over the coast in Matuba, where the mining is. Mafugile was killed a couple of months ago. The assassins came after midnight, shot her dead. This woman was 60 years old, fighting for the community, didn't want to sign any agreements regarding the expansion of the mine, and she was killed. And these are things we are faced on a daily basis, that the industry is ruthless. Not only does it treat us with contempt, it also treats us as that we don't exist. So Black people don't exist. We don't get jobs at these industries. Let me tell you, the population, there's very limited people employed at the corporations around us, and yet we've got a sea of industries. And that's because there's a double dose. They know that they affect us with their health. So you have to do a medical, and they won't employ you. Once the medical shows you've had asthma or some other respiratory illnesses, you don't get employed at the industry. And that's why we've got the highest unemployment rate. For the small communities in South Durban, we've got a very high level of unemployment plus high level of respiratory illnesses as well. And people are just there to work. Probably you'd work maybe even 6 weeks a year. You'd be fortunate enough to work at these places. And all the profits are shipped overseas to New York, to London, and to Melbourne, where it goes to and it's set up there. And nothing benefits the local community. You've got to see it to understand that how the racism, and you'd ask yourself the question, these are multi-billion rand profit corporations. Are they doing anything on to the communities where they are? They don't do anything. The other very critical issue of environmental justice is, and this concept came out of the US. We adopted it in '95 when we started to work on environmental issues and really put pressure and got the environmental laws developed in this country. But I think what's important here is that it's what I call cradle to grave. So you have 5 industrial belts within South Durban. You have the main industrial belt of the refinery and all that there, and all the products, and you have the secondary industries, all the products, and you have the storage facilities, and you got the biggest motor corporation in South Durban, Toyota. And from that, the waste, where do you think the waste goes to? The waste is inevitably put in Black communities in the townships. Unfortunately enough, I must say that we closed down 3. Never in my lifetime did I think that we'll shut 3 of them down. But working with the educators and the schools in South Durban and the community, we shut it down. And there's one that we tried to shut down, and then we had to go to court. And they took us to court to interdict us because they felt that we are a threat to them. So the big waste companies, the big mining companies that we talk about, the Anglo-Americans, the Oppenheimers and all, they also own the shares in the waste companies. It's amazing, Wasteman, you know, they own shares in it. And I've shut that down in 2011. It closed completely after 5 years of real mobilization of people. Then there's the Shongweni landfill site, where racism is really rife, where people are really sick. And that company, EnviroServe, and some of our political elites are captured there as well. So they got shares. So people's lives really don't matter. All they're concerned about, waste is money. And waste is bad news for a lot of people. Not only does it contaminate your rivers and streams and all, and the ocean, it also contaminates the ground. And so you can't even put any products after it's there. So, and government hasn't shifted to get this recycling and move away from plastics and all this other product, because the only way you'll be able to stop the waste is to actually stop it at its source. So that in a nutshell is environmental racism, where everything is placed in poor Black neighborhoods where people suffer the worst, and really government takes a huge amount of responsibility for not acting, despite the 1994 dream to move to a democratic and open democracy process. We have a lot of communities and people of color have not reached that dream or seen that dream as yet. And it only lies, the only way we're going to be able to change it, we've realized that it's about forming coalitions and coming together with a number of organizations that fight on behalf of poor people, whether social, whether it's the red or the green, bring them together. And that's the only way we'll be able to win against these big corporations who have governments backing, and environmental racism and continues to flourish, even in a democratic South Africa. And it'll take time, but we'll beat it in the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A few signs of hope, but overall a very difficult picture to see. I think then it leads me to open the floor to some questions, reflecting on the 3 presentations. I'm sure there are plenty. I did see a comment from one of the participants, but but who's no longer here, so I won't go back to that. But we're open to questions, and feel free to type them in, raise your hands, or send me a message directly if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. And just while we wait, I have a question for Nadia on the proposed bill that's been tabled. So Nadia has shared the details of that bill, which are in the chat, and I encourage you to have a look at it and the commentary on it that's also been shared. What are your thoughts on whether or not this bill will be passed into law? And if it is passed into law, what sort of difference do you think it will make?
So so over the summer, there's a group that checks like how likely a bill is to pass. It's called a SCOCUS lab. So over the summer, the bill had a 4% likelihood to pass. And after the election of Joe Biden, it dropped to a 2% chance of passing. And so I think there's some factors here, because one of them is like, what is the agenda for Joe Biden? But I think the other part is, what is the agenda for the environmental activists? And I think it's a part of being able to push the agenda forward, even if there's opposition from the administration, because what I see happening is there's like a framing of what environmental justice is supposed to be, but not exactly what environmental justice is. And so I see environmental justice being reframed as climate finance, green growth, without really addressing the issues of racism. And so I think this is really where there's going to have to be a push from activists to move it forward. And I think also it's just unsustainable for the way that we live. There's this area of science called cliodynamics, which looks at the differences between sociology and history, and basically makes history into a science, and shows that there's going to just be more protest and more movements against this. And so I think there's also, at the same time, there's a lot of bills that are being passed in the Jim Crow South against protests. And so there's being pushback in a lot of different ways, but I think that going forward, I think there's just going to be more a political will to have these issues brought forward.
Great, thanks so much. It's a bit discouraging, especially with there being so much attention on Black Lives Matter at the moment, that an environmental justice bill wouldn't have a bit more momentum. But hopefully it will gain some momentum. I still don't have any hands raised or comments in the chat just yet. So perhaps I'll then go over to Louis, a question for you, just following up. Could you tell us a little bit more about the strategic litigation against public participation judgment that just came out, and what its significance is for activists in the environmental justice space?
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. I think it's a massive kind of indication. I think it's a massive move, and I think it's a great indication of how slaps are being understood, because I think this understanding that activists are causing harm to business, are protesting for ulterior motives, that there's this underlying reason why protests are occurring, and it's not for the progress of rights, and it's not because people are frustrated about service delivery and impacts on their health. This understanding that these activists are somehow hindering growth, are painted as against, progress. That was, I think, what the judgment said about that was a clear indication that the court saw through this facade that the mine had painted about how people were going out of their way to cause harm to their business. And these are debates that have happened for many, many years around environmental activists, around how they're anti-development. Environmental activists are not against anti-development. Well, I can't speak for everybody. I can speak for myself. I don't think environmental activists are anti-development. I think environmental activists want business that creates opportunities, that is respectful of the laws, and can really has the, not the interest, maybe not the people's interests in all, but at least is compliant with their licenses, and would at least, the net benefit of the industry will be more than the harm that it creates. I really liked how the court cut through all that rhetoric and said, here we have people fighting for their rights, where the state themselves are falling short, where the state does not have the manpower or people power rather to do proper compliance monitoring and enforcement. And the doctor was right about how we do have great laws, but either no political will or no capacity to enforce them. And it actually becomes the community's responsibility where the state fails. And it's incredibly unfortunate. But the community now has to stand up. And as soon as they stand up, they get charged with all kinds of offenses, protest-related offenses, disturbing the peace, unlawful protest, malicious damage to property. All these things are tools that are used. And I think the corporations use these tools very effectively, particularly where people lack resources. So I think the judgment was great in that. It broke down what is a SLAP suit, and this particular case fitted perfectly into the elements of what a SLAP suit was. So I think definite progress and definite positive jurisprudence.
Thanks so much. I hope that's helpful for everyone, because it's a really recent judgment just earlier this month. So it's great that we've got an expert in Louis to tell us a bit about it. And obviously it's very much on point, because environmental justice isn't only about recognizing these uneven patterns of distribution, but also the underlying causes of those patterns, which include silencing people and treating some people as less entitled to protection, or as less worthy of protection and health and well-being than others. I see we have a question from Professor Michael Kidd, so I'll go over to him before coming back to some of the comments.
Thanks, Melanie, and thank you to the speakers. I suppose that the main person that I'm targeting this question to would be Desmond, but maybe Louis has some thoughts as well. Let's assume a situation where we used our laws, we used the Constitution, we used the provision on environmental justice in NEMA, and whatever other environmental provisions would be necessary in order to be able to mount such a case. Envisaging, say, a scenario where there was a case against one of the industries in South Durban that Desmond was talking about, or similar scenarios in the Mpumalanga Highveld or whatever. My question would be, what ultimately would the remedy be that people would be looking for? Because I suppose ultimately in the South Durban situation, I'm picking on that because I kind of know that a bit better than other parts of the country. Ultimately, I think the people living there would want to be living in an area where there's no industry. But how realistic would it be for that industry all to disappear? I mean, would it be that people would be happy if the remedy were simply that the industries complied with certain standards that they aren't complying with at the moment? given that many of the standards that are legislated in South African law are probably vastly inadequate in any event.
Dr.
Should
Dasa,
I-
yes, please.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I know you know the South Durban area, so let's just take a case in example right now that's currently taking place in August, 18th of August last year, 2020. Engen, the senior management of Petronas announces that in 2 years' time, they want to close the refinery now. I think it's going to cost them too much money because it needs a rebuild, or it's cheaper to import from Malaysia, the petrol. And I don't believe in passing the buck to another country, not in my backyard, so it's in someone else's backyard. But let's just say that the scenario is that. And then it blows up on the 4th of December last year. The diesel desulfurized unit blows up like a bomb. It affects thousands of people within a radius of as far as Mhlanga Rocks or even Westville and Pinetown. And lots of people are traumatized and injured. And Engen says, well, in meetings with government, they say, look, we don't have the money to rebuild. If we have to build, we have to build. We can't replace anything. You have to rebuild it completely. It'll cost over 800 million. So they want the taxpayers to pay for it, right? And then they come out with a statement to say, look, if we don't rebuild, we want to decommission the entire refinery. And in its place, we'll put up a storage tank. We're saying that's just as bad. So the communities are saying we need to have a say in that. What development should be there? Knowing fully well that we've been harmed all these years. For 66 years, people have been harmed with high levels of toxic pollution. And some of the nasty chemicals like your benzene and toluene and xylene and other nasty chemicals that come out of these refineries. So what people are saying, we need jobs, but what sort of jobs do we need? We should determine what sort of jobs that are going to create jobs that we want a just transition. So if the refinery wants to close, that's fine. Let's sit down, let's have a discussion around it. And that discussion should consider a number of things. And I'll tell you now about what it is. What we want, how do they remediate the site? They should have had an insurance put aside to remediate that site. Who's going to do that remediation? Because so then you can create jobs as well. Just removing all that burn plant completely will create jobs. And then the third thing is that what do we want during that period? What sort of industry do we want? We know that in some parts of Africa, the northern parts of Africa, Morocco, let's just take Morocco. They supplying, with all that solar energy that they put up there, they're supplying Europe with the energy. Now we know that Germany is doing 40%, they're moving to 60% of energy needs. We've got the best climate in South Africa. We've got much more energy sources than anything else. Why can't we determine what we want there? That will create millions of jobs for our people. That will not harm the environment. That will not harm our marine resources, because all the pollution that goes into our streams and into the ocean, in the Indian Ocean, has been destroyed, destroys the fish population. So there are ideas that can, and the other thing what we are concerned about is this model of bringing in and shipping in goods from all over the world. For example, we bring in a huge amount of goods here that destroys the local industry. If we create our small economic zones in all the communities, we could alleviate unemployment, we could alleviate poverty, we could alleviate people not having a source of income. Now, that discussion doesn't get taken place here. Tito Mboweni develops a budget, no discussion with the population in this country. What is their vision of the budget, where the money should be spent? And likewise with the industry, they got deals. By the time they get to us to have these EIAs and all that there, the deal's already cut. It's just an exercise that we have to go through. And that's been our fight over the years, to say we want to be actively participating, because then we can determine what sort of development needs that will be beneficial to everyone. So yeah, so that's how it is, and really and truly, we are not against industrial growth. It's what sort of industrial growth that is developed, that doesn't harm the environment, that doesn't contaminate our water resources, doesn't lead to massive landfall and hazardous landfill sites that you're aware of, Jeremy. And also, people don't have high levels of health problems that they got to pay. We want industry that doesn't externalize the costs, because at the moment, all the costs is externalized to the environment and to the people, and we're paying the price extensively. And I think the industries have shown they have no respect for that. And do we still need to continue after 66 years of experience of an industry that has killed so many people in South Durban, harmed so many people, polluted the environment so much, and everybody's fully aware of it? Do we still want to go down and continue down that road, or we want a new beginning? I think we've seen during COVID level 5 and 4, we could see the city from 100 kilometers away, clean air. All the industries were stopped. No one was suffering with coughing, with chest, with coughing and all that there. We were all healthy people. The moment they, at level 3, they gave the industry the carte blanche to reopen, it blew up and everybody got sick. And I'm saying this with facts. And I think that we all know, most of the people in the city and in our province are fully aware that we can't live without these chemical industry. We've seen it during the COVID level 5 and 4. We can't live without them. We just got to determine what's the future going forward, because the oil industry hasn't got an everlasting, that will continue forever. Sooner or later, it's peaked already, and it's already on the downward trajectory. We need to decide what's the next energy need that we need for this country that will supply people with energy, but also ensure that we have a vibrant industry that can create jobs. I hope I've answered that question.
Thanks. I think that was very comprehensive. I think it's also in some ways unfair to say to the people most affected, which business would you do without, when the people who are most privileged don't have to confront those difficult choices. And it sort of goes to Sarah's comment as well, is should people in Mabola have to choose between mining in their backyards or jobs? Do any of us have to make that choice? And is that a real dichotomy, or is it a false one? I'm going to just let Louis respond to Sarah's comment. And we do have to start wrapping up. So I think if the speakers can have a look at the comments, and as Louis is commenting, add any thoughts that you might have in the chat that we can then address those before we wrap up. If it's all right, we'll wrap up in the next 3 or 4 minutes. But for those who do need to rush off now, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Melanie. Just in response to Michael's comment, in terms of the demands, I mean, I could never put myself in the shoes of the community, but I think there's definitely scope for some sort of legacy related compensation. This persistent kind of impact, possibly something, just trying to be creative in the realm of silicosis judgment. I would say something like that could be maybe certify the class action and move on from that perspective, and then significant rehabilitation. And then also community involvement in multi-stakeholder environmental monitoring. I think that going forward, because the state doesn't have the capacity, and then the communities are upskilling themselves, there's an enormous role for them to play. Moving on to the other comment, and it'll be the last thing that I say. In response to and I think what's being asked here is the practical realization of environmental justice. Is environmental justice just this, fluffy kind of principle that isn't really implemented. Well, the truth of the matter is, yes, it is that, unfortunately, because the decision makers themselves don't understand the concept and definitely don't take the concept into consideration when deciding on licenses and making certain decisions around environmental impact assessments. And I think that's where it actually lies. It's how to translate environmental justice into that decision-making process. And I think at the core of it is at the EIA stage. There should be particular factors that are linked to environmental justice. Now, it's a very broad concept, but for me, I think we're talking not only of net benefit and of sustainable development, because obviously sustainable development can be scaled in various ways. Sustainable development for who? Sustainable development for the region of South Durban, or sustainable development for the entire South Africa? What is the application of that? And I think environmental justice suffers the same kind of obstacle, has the same kind of obstacle in front of it. And I think the practical kind of tools that we use are very useful, but always remembering that we cannot have a situation where the people in and around a specific area have disproportionate impact. And what will that mean? And those kinds of discussions will have to be had. And is this around using new technology? Is this around alternatives? Is this around alternative sites, or are you just shifting the problem, as the previous speaker said? Is it about offsets? Is this about creating some sort of environmental justice manual in terms of its practical application? I think it is. And is it about training decision makers in understanding what environmental justice means practically? So those are my last words. Thank you so much, Melanie. Thanks so much, everybody, Desmond, Nadia, everybody. Thank you so much for having me, and appreciate it. Cheers.
Thanks, Louis, and thanks to everyone. I don't want to keep us outside of the time, so I'll just ask if Nadia has any closing remarks, and then from your side in response to anything that's been said, or any of the questions in the chat, and then I'll wrap it up.
So in response to one of the questions in the chat, like in the absence of federal legislation, what should be done? The legislation can be taken at the state level as well as at the city and county levels. So, but I think those environmental protections would be weaker. I think we should still push for federal legislation, even if it doesn't happen immediately. I think that's something that needs to be pushed for. And so I really wanted to thank everybody and my co-panelists as well for joining in this discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So it's just now my duty to say thank you to everyone who joined, and thank you specifically to the panel speakers for sharing their expertise. It's been really enlightening, and sorry we couldn't get in detail through all the questions. I see there were some great questions also about whether our Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, which gives effect to our equality rights, could be used to respond to environmental injustice. That's definitely something to think about. I'd like to thank each of you, and also just encourage you to join the Environmental Law Association to get more information about environmental regulation in South Africa, and to join our next screening event, where we will be speaking about Reclaim the City's activism and the problem of spatial apartheid. There's a brilliant episode, it's also very short, about struggles on the part of Reclaim the City in Cape Town to deal with spatial apartheid there. And that will be in a month's time, at the same time, in more or less the same place. So hopefully we'll see some of you back then. Also thank you to our chairperson, Peter, for joining us, and for all the members and friends of the ELA who were here. and have a wonderful evening. Desmond, anything from your side? Sorry, I didn't give you a last chance.
No, thanks a lot, Melanie. I really, yeah, and I would come back, I can tell you now. Thanks to everyone that joined us tonight. I think environmental justice is not an easy topic. We could talk for weeks on the subject, but feel free, anyone wants to get all of my details. You know, we've got a thriving website. All the information's up there. There's no patents. People can use the information, and we can connect up to any other questions. They feel free to also, they can connect up and ask further questions if they want to.
Great.
So thank you so much.
Great. And South Durban Community Environmental Alliance also has a lovely Facebook page that's very active. And so please do follow them to get information as well about their really brilliant activism that they do, and to support them in any way that you can. And we'll be keeping a close eye on developments in the US and hoping that that bill comes to fruition. And Louis, all the best with your environmental justice work as well. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks, Melanie. Bye-bye.
Bye.